Understand Inchon, you have to understand desperation. On June 25, 1950, 7 divisions of the Korean People's Army, 89,000 men trained by Soviet advisors and equipped with T-34 tanks, crossed the 38th parallel at 4 in the morning. Within 3 days, Seoul fell. Within 6 weeks, the North Koreans had driven every American and South Korean unit into a shrinking box around the southeastern port of Busan. The perimeter measured only 100 miles by 50 miles. Lieutenant General Walton Walker, commanding the U.S. 8th Army, issued a directive on July 29 that became known as the Stand or Die Order. There would be, he said, no more retreating. There was nowhere left to retreat to. Every division the Pentagon could scrape together, the 24th Infantry, the 25th Infantry, the 1st Cavalry, the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade, was fed into the meat grinder. By early September, the North Koreans held 90% of the Korean peninsula. Their supply lines stretched 400 miles from the border down to the Naktong River. Their divisions were exhausted, but they were winning. In Tokyo, one man saw something no one else did. General of the Army Douglas MacArthur, 70 years old, Supreme Commander of Allied Powers in Japan, hero of the Pacific, spread a map across his desk in the Dai-Ikai building and put his finger on a port most of his staff could not pronounce. Inchon, 200 miles behind enemy lines. Cut the North Korean supply artery there, he said, and their entire army in the south collapses. The Joint Chiefs of Staff sent Generals J. Lawton Collins and Forrest Sherman to Tokyo to talk him out of it. They failed. And what MacArthur was about to attempt, no naval officer in history had ever tried. The problem was not the enemy. The problem was the water. Inchon has among the most extreme tidal ranges on planet Earth, a 29 to 32-foot swing between high and low water. At low tide, the approaches turn into 2 miles of stinking mud flats that will swallow a landing craft whole. At high tide, the approach channel, a single crooked passage called Flying Fish Channel, is barely wide enough for one ship mined and dominated by a fortified island called WWII, connected to Inchon proper by a 600-yard causeway. On top of all that, there were only 3 days in the entire fall of 1950 when the tide would rise high enough for a landing. September 15. October 11, November 3, missed the first date and the war might be lost before the second one arrived. Rear Admiral James Doyle briefed the plan to the Joint Chiefs and closed with a sentence that became famous. The best I can say is that Inchon is not impossible. Admiral Arthur Radford, commanding the Pacific Fleet, listed every reason the operation would fail. The current was 7 knots. There was no beach, just concrete seawalls 15 feet high. The city of Inchon had 250,000 civilians the Marines would have to fight through. MacArthur listened, stood up, and delivered a 45-minute monologue that Admiral Sherman later admitted was the most compelling argument he had ever heard from a soldier. "We shall land at Inchon," MacArthur said, "and I shall crush them." Now, if this is landing, save this video. You will want to come back to this one. The plan was called Operation Chromite. X-Corps was activated under Major General Edward Ned Almond, MacArthur's own Chief of Staff. The landing force, the 1st Marine Division, 25,000 strong under Major General Oliver P. Smith, a quiet, thoughtful officer who privately thought the plan was reckless. Behind them, the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division. Above them, the aircraft of Task Force 77. In total, 261 ships from 7 nations. And on the other end of the Flying Fish Channel, defending WWII and Inchon, roughly 6,500 North Korean troops from the 226th Independent Marine Regiment and the 918th Coastal Artillery Regiment. At 6:33 a.m. on September 15, 1950, the 3rd Battalion of the 5th Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Robert Taplett hit Green Beach on WWII. The bombardment had been merciless, 3 days of naval gunfire from the cruisers Toledo and Rochester, and rocket ships that unloaded 6,000 rockets in 22 minutes. WWII fell in 45 minutes. American casualties, 17 wounded, 0 killed. Then the Marines had to wait, because the tide had gone out. For 12 hours, 1 battalion of American Marines sat on a captured island 600 yards from a city of 250,000 North Korean-held people, while the enemy watched them and did nothing. The North Korean command, briefed by Soviet advisors, had convinced themselves Inchon was too dangerous to be the real target. They believed the landing had to be a diversion. At 5:30 p.m., the tide came back, and with it came the storm. Red Beach lay on the northern edge of Inchon proper, a stretch of concrete seawall dominated by a hill called Cemetery Ridge. The 5th Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Murray had to go over the wall using aluminum scaling ladders assembled in Japan the week before. Blue Beach, to the south, was worse, a mudflat backed by industrial buildings and defended by dug-in infantry. The 1st Marines under Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, already a legend from Guadalcanal and Peleliu, had to fight through it. The landing began at 5:33 p.m. under low overcast, with Typhoon Kezia passing just to the south. 1st Lieutenant Baldomero Lopez of the 5th Marines led his platoon over the seawall at Red Beach, was hit by machine gun fire, and threw himself on a grenade to save his men. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. On Blue Beach, landing craft grounded on the wrong stretches of mudflat, units mixed together in the darkness, and Puller ordered his officers to simply move inland and sort it out at dawn. By midnight, 13,000 Marines were ashore. American losses: 21 killed, 174 wounded. North Korean losses on the beachheads alone: over 1,350 killed. The next 4 days became a running battle through the streets of Inchon and along the Kimpo Highway. Kimpo Airfield, the largest air base in Korea, fell on September 18. The 7th Infantry Division landed and pushed south. Allman drove Smith and Puller mercilessly, demanding Seoul be taken by September 25, 3 months to the day after the invasion had begun. Marines fought house by house through the industrial suburbs of Yangdongpo. The 1st Marines took the city block by bloody block, using flamethrowers and satchel charges. Seoul was officially declared liberated on September 27, 1950. Marines raised the American flag over the U.S. Embassy. 2 days later, MacArthur personally handed the city back to South Korean President Syngman Rhee in a ceremony under a shattered dome of the National Assembly building. But the strategic effect had already detonated. Down south, along the Pusan perimeter, General Walker's 8th Army had launched its breakout on September 16. The moment the North Koreans realized their supply lines had been severed at Inchon, their army in the south simply came apart. Divisions that had fought like tigers for 2 months dissolved into small groups of starving men trying to walk 300 miles back to the border. Of the roughly 70,000 North Korean troops south of Seoul, perhaps 25,000 made it home. The rest were killed, captured, or scattered into the hills as guerrillas. In 3 weeks, the war MacArthur had inherited on the verge of catastrophe looked completely won. Here is what the history books often leave out: the very qualities that made Inchon possible: the absolute self-confidence, the willingness to override every expert, the certainty that MacArthur alone could see what others could not, became a poison after victory. Because MacArthur believed his own legend now, and so did Washington. On September 27, President Harry Truman authorized crossing the 38th parallel. On October 1, South Korean troops entered North Korea. On October 15, Truman flew to Wake Island to meet MacArthur in person and ask a single question: would the Chinese intervene? MacArthur told him no. If they did, he said, it would be the greatest slaughter because American air power would destroy them. He estimated Chinese intervention at, quote, very little probability. Marshal Peng Dehuai crossed the Yalu River on October 19 with 260,000 men. By late November, MacArthur's forces, split into 2 separate commands with a 50-mile gap between them, a deployment every staff officer had warned against, were shattered at the Changchan River and the Chosin Reservoir. The 1st Marine Division, the same division that had climbed the seawalls at Inchon, fought its way out of encirclement at Chosin in temperatures of -30 Fahrenheit, breaking 6 Chinese divisions in the process, but suffering over 12,000 casualties. The retreat from North Korea became the longest in American military history. On April 11, 1951, Truman relieved MacArthur of command. The general who had saved South Korea in September was fired 7 months later for insubordination, for publicly advocating expansion of the war into China, for undermining the president's peace overtures, for behaving in the end like a man who thought he could not be wrong. Inchon changed everything. It saved the Republic of Korea, which today is the world's 10th largest economy. It validated large-scale amphibious warfare in the atomic age, a doctrine every Marine Corps on Earth still studies. It set the template for the Joint Task Force operations the U.S. military has used ever since. And it stands, 76 years later, as the single clearest example in modern history of what one commander's judgment can accomplish for good and for ruin, when everyone else has told him no. CTA 1213 Min. If you want more forgotten decisions that reshaped modern war, the orders, the mistakes, the moments the textbooks skip over, subscribe and hit the bell icon. New battle every Wednesday. And drop it in the comments. Was MacArthur a genius punished for his ambition, or an egotist who got lucky at Inchon and unlucky at the Yalu? I read every answer. Outro 1315 Min. The lesson of Inchon is not that boldness always wins. The lesson is that the same trait can save an army in September and destroy one in November. MacArthur's certainty was a weapon. Turned against a demoralized enemy at Flying Fish Channel, It produced the most improbable victory of the 20th century. Turned against the warnings of his own intelligence officers about Chinese intentions, it produced disaster. Every great commander in history has walked that same edge: Napoleon at Austerlitz and again at Waterloo, Rommel in France and again at El Alamein, Lee at Chancellorsville and again at Gettysburg. Genius and hubris are often the same muscle, used in different rooms. If this one hit, my next video breaks down the Chosin Reservoir breakout, the 17-day fighting retreat where 30,000 Marines and soldiers under Oliver Smith broke 6 Chinese divisions in the coldest battle America ever fought. If you thought Inchon was the impossible operation, wait until you see what happened at WWII. See you Wednesday. On September 15, 1950, General Douglas MacArthur launched Operation Chromite, an amphibious landing at Inchon, Korea, that the U.S. Navy said had a 5,000 to 1 chance of failure. 32-foot tides, no beaches, a seawall, and 6,500 defending North Korean troops. Behind them, the last American forces in Korea were minutes from being pushed into the sea at Busan. What MacArthur did next saved South Korea, destroyed the North Korean People's Army, and set the template for modern amphibious warfare. And 7 months later, it got him fired. This is the full story of Inchon, the plan the Joint Chiefs opposed, the seawalls the Marines climbed with aluminum ladders, and the strategic collapse that followed. Featuring Major General Oliver P. Smith, Colonel Louis Chesty, Puller, Lieutenant Baldomero Lopez, Major General Edward Almond, and the 1st Marine Division. 00, the 5,000 to 1 gamble 00, 30 Korea on the brink, the Busan perimeter 03, 00 Operation Chromite, the impossible plan 06, 00 September 15, Red Beach and Blue Beach 09, 00 Seoul Falls, the North Korean Army collapses 12, 00 from Triumph to Chosin, MacArthur's fall 13, 30 Subscribe for Forgotten Battles, new battle every Wednesday. Subscribe and hit the bell icon. Military history, Korean War, Inchon, MacArthur, Cold War.